So what we thought we would do, give each of them, a chance to kind of provide a introduction to what they're doing, what their work is with different standardizing bodies. We want to bring it, kind of more, ground it, back home, and talk more about, how do we get from, what they're doing to, what's actually going on today. So we have a few questions. I definitely want to, encourage, questions from the audience or discussion from the audience. So to get things started, maybe if I can just start with you, Dave. At what point do network operators, and let's focus on the mainstream, not like the bleeding edge, really start looking at SDN? And what are the use cases that they start focusing on? And let's try to keep more mainstream, enterprise, rather than talking like someone like Google.
I don't know. To be honest with you, I don't know. I mean, I look at what I do in my work is I look at what's going to happen, not what is happening so much. I try to analyze what's happening in terms of that. And so I'm not an expert on enterprise, even though I gave a talk on enterprise at the ONS last time because Guru had asked me to, but I had to go learn it, right? So the way I see the SDN thing unfolding right now is actually cascading down from the hyperscales to the enterprises and to the smaller enterprises. And I was talking to somebody about this the other day. It's basically what those guys, it used to be what those guys did was like years ahead of everybody else. But the actual thing that's going on now is that there's this compression of product, not only development cycles, but product life cycles. So the distance from Google to, wherever, your enterprise is not that far in time. It's not that far. And so what's going on out there is going to be relevant to people who are in smaller and non-hyperscales. And by the way, if you ever hear somebody go, well, it doesn't really need to scale, that's the kiss of death, right? Everything needs to scale. It's just that, and if it doesn't need to scale, you don't care about it, right? So, because you could just stay under Moore's law. And so my sense of it is that the SDN thing is really, as I said earlier, it's about changing control from passive to active. And when we do that, I mean, there's all this stuff about splitting control in data planes and all the economic aspects of that and all of that. That's nowhere near as important as this idea that now we're going to have active control in networks. And once we have that, that's going to open up all kinds of different things even for enterprises. So for example, the talk I gave, I think it was last year, at ONS, was really about how to use OpenFlow in an enterprise. It was based on some work that Nick Feimster and his folks did down at Georgia Tech, how to use OpenFlow in an enterprise to do wireless authentication. So all of this stuff becomes available, and new kinds of ways of doing this become available when we have this infrastructure. So I don't really feel like obviously the Googles and all of these guys are doing things that are further out, but the time from there to here is being compressed by the same technology that we're talking about here. So that's something to observe. The technology itself is causing the acceleration. So there's a feedback loop. So there's acceleration here. And I think most of us haven't quite grasped that yet, especially in the vendor community that don't understand yet how ephemeral artifacts are going to be in the future.
And I think that's part of the reason why for some customers you're seeing NFV catch on a little quicker, right? It's because it's the more immediate, the more we can right now start using it and start getting it. And that's why I think in some cases you're going to see some people get their first kind of taste of an SDN type solution under an NFV umbrella, just because of the fact that you can innovate quicker, you can get it out faster, you can get builds out faster, you can basically rework a whole data center quicker if you're just doing a software change than if you're waiting for a drag on a hardware release.
Yeah, so to Michael's question about, well, instead of the bleeding edge, let's talk more about mainstream. And what's kind of interesting is in the service provider or even Web 2.0 space, the mainstream is at the bleeding edge right now. I think the enterprises, unless you've got a bunch of developers on site, it's going to be a little tricky. The risk-benefit trade-off, it doesn't make sense to dive into SDN. You should be tracking it, but don't have to dive into it right now. I mean, your infrastructure is probably going to be running SDN I don't know, in 18 months or 24 months or something, and I'll talk about that more at Interop, thanks to Ethan, actually. But for the service providers, they're in the opposite situation. If they don't invest, if they don't go after this, they're toast. And the cloud providers are in the same situation. So we do have those kind of freaks out in front. Amazon's been running SDN since before we were calling it SDN, really. So, and they're not running VMware, which has also been SDN since before SDN. But there's a bunch of Amazon wannabes, and that's what's going on at racks and other spaces. They're like, geez, we need to catch up with these people, and we're not going to build it ourselves the way Amazon did. We're going to have to like work with the ecosystem to do it. And there's Google that's off there, installing fiber to everybody's home in 30 different cities, and all the service providers are going to go, Jesus Christ, that before we only had to race, now we have to outrun the bear or whatever, right? So. Suddenly they're at the bleeding edge, and they do have the developers, and this is so core to their existence. The one place where I see that you might call enterprise is the financial services, where their networks are so core to their differentiation. Those high-end financial firms, they're active in places like ONF and other places. So at some level, the mainstream is feeling the bleeding edge stuff.
But I think it depends on if it's a differentiator, right? If networking is a differentiator for you, then getting into the nuances of making your own noodles makes a lot of sense, right? If you sell flowers and networking is really critical to you, but not your core business, then maybe you want something a little more shrink wrapped, and that might mean you wait a little longer. But at the end, what you're hearing over and over and over again is faster, 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 right? This is all about faster. It isn't always about saving money, right? Money is often saved as a result, but it's more importantly, it's about faster.
I agree with that. That's a really good point. All my survey data says nobody's looking to save money. They want faster, they want visibility, and they want motion.
It's a lovely secondary effect.
Yeah,
but that's not.
When you create money at the business level and with a faster network, faster troubleshooting, smoother operations, you make money. But you don't save money in terms of CapEx or OpEx. You don't reduce your number of staff. And people aren't looking, so the survey data I've got, people aren't looking to save money in their IT infrastructures. They're just looking to deliver better back to the company.
Get more out of the money they're spending.
Make money, yeah.
Yep.
When you say faster, do you mean, what do you mean?
Faster speeds, faster mobility, better visibility, better integration.
Faster delivery?
Faster response
right?
to business.
If you increase productivity northbound to the business by having faster bandwidth, faster operations, faster mobility, better visibility, faster visibility. The ability to click on something and go, there's my problem. That's faster visibility, right? That's what matters, because then IT, the money in the, no one wants to reduce the money spent in IT. We all talk about it. What we actually want is more value from IT. Mm-hmm. We want to get rid of Windows and replace it with a decent laptop. We want mail to be delivered.
Some people.
Yeah. But
I'm one of them.
You get my point, right? Yep. The idea is that if the accounting system could run faster, more reliably, and I could feel confident, like Josh here, right? He's got no idea what the carriers are doing to his network. And they randomly turn stuff on. They're weeks behind delivering on promises. But he's got no visibility into that process because
Netflix doesn't work.
Thinking about that from a different perspective, because I have a very different background. I'm not from enterprise. I come from research and education, big science data and things like that. So bleeding edge is, we had to be there all the time, right? But if you look at it from an enterprise perspective, so a lot of the purpose-built networks for moving science data around are exactly that. They're greenfield, they're purpose-built, so you can step right into the bleeding edge with very minimal risk, right? Because there's a need there, and that that bleeding edge stuff fills that need.
It also doesn't hurt that the NSF is funding it, right?
Well, that doesn't hurt. In some cases,
many cases,
yeah. Like for the CCNIE proposals is a really great example of that. Right. But in enterprise, it's often a network that's been around for a very long time. It's critical to their business. Change is scary, and they're very conservative. So it's not a greenfield. And let's be honest. Who's going to tear out their network that's been around for 15, 20 years and just go ahead and jump into something brand new? No company is going to do that. Amazon can do it because they were spinning up something no one else had, right? And that's a common theme with what we're talking about here. Is a lot of these cloud providers are providing something that was at the time brand new, and so they were building from a greenfield perspective. So I think from the enterprise, it's too big of a change. That's where I think the NFV stuff comes in, because it's an easy intermediary in between the two.
But it also shows why we are hurting ourselves, right? The last big Oracle environment I managed, right? I only got 6 hours of downtime a year. It took me an hour and a half to shut it down. It took me an hour and a half to bring it back up. So I got to do security patches. right? Now there were years and years where new features were coming out, new functionality was coming out that I couldn't get on that box because I didn't have time, I didn't have the cycles, I didn't have the ability to implement it. And so other technologies came and replaced it. So this is also about making it easier for those enterprise environments to make change, making it less risky for them to take on new technologies. Because right now we've made it so scary and painful to do so that we're keeping people from taking advantage of our own engineering.
This is the point about engineering systems being more important in some cases than the artifacts themselves. You know?
Yeah, so I think we're kind of leading to the next question is and it's about the consumption model. So what needs to change in organizations, both from a vendor point of view and then also from the the consumer, from the whether it's a service provider or a enterprise, probably more so on the enterprise, like in their IT organization. What are some of the things that need to change? Maybe there are parts that can stay the same, but in order for them to kind of move to SDN or NFV.
Can I take a shot at this real quick?
Please.
Yeah, go ahead, let's hear it.
Our other panelist, Josh.
Yeah, this is what exactly needs to happen is we need to have more engineers. We need to have a lot less people in enterprise who pretend they're engineers and have titles of engineer, but all they're doing is managing consultants and dealing with RFPs. They need to be able to actually do the work, understand what the business is, and to be able to use the technology to drive the business forward, not to protect their own ass, and to keep a new budget. It's exactly what has to happen.
No doubt. The other thing is that I would just add to that is that there's a shifting, and I've seen this in a lot of enterprises, there's a shifting skill set that's behind NFV and behind SDN that network engineers need to have that they don't have. And that results in some organizational pathologies that are basically in the CYA variety, And so a lot of this, and a lot of the enterprises that I've talked to, the problem of how to go from the CLI jockey stuff to the DevOps stuff is a huge hurdle. Nobody knows how to do that right now. It involves massive retraining of staff and things like that.
And the desire to do so.
We see a lot of this in a bunch of SPs, that organizational tension, where people are trying to hold on to their piece of the pie, when if they would loosen up, they could have a bigger pie and not worried so much about the, they're either going to have a shrinking pie or a growing pie, and they'll hold on to their small piece of a shrinking pie, or they can let go and get
For me,
a bigger
this
pie.
also means silos were a really bad idea. I'm not saying they don't work in certain cases, but the instant you compartmentalize to a point where I don't have to care about the resource restraints on another group, I will pass my bottleneck. That's how it works.
And you look at the NFV like we were talking about. So is that going to be in networking or in compute? I mean, who owns that? Is that hardware, server?
But it didn't used to be all that carved up, right? You used to have the senior team. Right? You're the senior team, and you did networking, you did security, you did everything because you were the senior guys, and that's what you did, right? And so how we got into this very carved up model where I only know how to do these 5 things, I don't quite see what the benefit was unless you were a middle manager who just got a new group.
Discipline.
IT
was very undisciplined in the early 90s, and so we implemented IT service management, and then they created ITIL, which turned everything into a legacy factory. You work this machine, and that's the only machine you know. And that created really good production lines, but unflexible, uncreative, low productivity. But it was better than the alternative when we all wore cowboy hats.
Yes.
And now we need to change that practice, but that's a different.
And how do we keep that new stability, but get rid of the restraints?
I'll just point out that this is already happening. You don't need NFV for this, right? In the cloud, you have the cloud stuff, right? So now I have a vSwitch that's in a server whose domain,
Yeah.
Yep.
I use the vSwitch as an example whenever I talk about this with anybody, because that's like the biggest early example of
kind of canonical example.
Yeah, it's the no man's land.
Yep.
Nobody
the
wants
fact
to
of the matter
manage
is, it's not something that you're going to be able to decide it belongs to this group or that group. The groups are going to have to merge, right?
Yep.
It's going to move into one infrastructure.
Well, both groups have to come together on that. Because I'm not going to ever be a hypervisor guy. That's not my thing. Right. But I will know enough about the hypervisor so that I can speak on your level.
Needs to be enough overlap that you can
exactly.
You can not miss the details.
Yeah, networking is going to be my forte. Virtualization is going to be your forte.
The problem here is not the engineers. The problem here is the executives, managers.
So here's the thing. So I actually am like Josh. I actually manage a team, and I mean, for like the last 8 years, nobody on my team has been a network engineer or a systems administrator or anything. I've got guys that at 1 minute are working on big legacy, incumbent vendor, switches, and the next minute they're implementing, storage, and the next minute they're whatever. And you know what? We pay for training for that, and so nobody is in a silo. I mean, we have some people who are definitely better at Oracle, let's say, or whatever it may be. But that's not all they do.
And we have a tendency as engineers to focus on things. We shouldn't be allowed to, right? We should be forced to keep some breadth, because otherwise it's hard to know what everyone else is doing. It's hard to keep track of the whole system.
But the complexity of the technology that we implement speaks to the fact that we have these silos, because you can go down so deep into this technology.
Agreed.
It's so complex and hard to implement that it's hard to focus on other things too. So there's an element of simplification that needs to come into IT as well.
Yeah, well, when things were stable, it made sense to focus on efficiency, and so we would just get things working very, the fewest people, and you didn't worry about change, which requires training and knowledge and people talking to each other. And now it's like, well, no, we need to build these systems that manage themselves. We need to architect it in advance. We need to think about it beforehand, not be reactive, but be proactive, and that's a different game.
A couple things. Have you guys seen that deck that Kyle Mastri wrote about what the network engineer of the future looks like?
Yeah.
I'll put it on. I'll tweet it when I get off here, and so you guys can see it. It's a really good deck about what kind of skills you might need in the future. The other thing I want to say is kind of like following up on that kind of thought. I think the future of networking, well, the whole thing, the compute, storage, networking, security, and energy, CSNSE, you're right. That whole thing, the future of that is radically different than what we see right now. It's going to be radically different, and all of this stuff we're seeing right now is sort of the substrate on which that different future is going to be built. And we need to start ramping all of our skill sets up to understand this, because, like we're talking about, like the hyperscales are there already. And when that stuff gets to, when that stuff filters down, the kind of skill sets that we'll need and the kind of things we're going to try to have to understand, we're going to be radically different. And I think that's one of the biggest concerns I have about our industry right now, is we're not forward-looking enough, even though we're doing these things like NFV. NFV it's interesting, and it has the economic properties that, Kelly was articulating so eloquently, but it's not the cultural shift in the telcos. It itself is kind of dull as a technology, right? It's not that interesting, and it doesn't change the architecture of the network, and I think that's kind of core to why people can deploy it, yep. Right? Whereas in SDN, it's like, oh, we're changing the architecture, and that's just like, what the, whoa, what's going on here? Yep. So that's one thing. But I can kind of see this future that most of our skills aren't the right ones right now, and I think all of these enterprises aren't really, including service providers for that matter, aren't really looking at it in that way. They're looking at sort of incremental changes, and incrementalism is good because it's economically feasible, and it's feasible with the talent sets you have. But I think that's a dangerous path to go down right now.
Okay, so final question before we move to the next topic, and to tie this back to what Brocade's doing. Why is Brocade committed to open source, and why are we investing so much into it, and how is that kind of helping bridge the gap?
I'll try. First off, open source, it has economic consequences. First off, if you get good open source community, then you have this gigantic bunch of people who are developing code, and you can get the benefit of that. That's a strong benefit if it works, right? And if you develop a community and if you build good code. So one of the things for Brocade is, if we can get a really nice controller out of open daylight, that's helpful to us because we don't have to build that ourselves, and that takes a lot. That takes a lot of work and a lot of expertise. So that's good. And then we could build value-added applications on top of that and spend our time building innovation at that level instead of the sort of the platform level, right? So that's really good. And the other thing is, you grow a community, you grow an industry this way. And I think if you talk to people at Red Hat, you'll get the feeling from them that, hey, we're doing well, but I mean, they grew an industry and they grew a community, and that was very powerful for the larger industry in general. So
think about that from the point of view of how hard it is to find good Linux people now, right? I mean, it's like, people coming out of university now have all sorts of Linux experience, right? And I mean, those are ecosystems that have to grow over time. We have to seed groups, we have to seed technology. So this is about, innovating where you need to innovate so that you can leverage it between groups.
So similarly to what Dave was saying, but just a different take on it. And we talked earlier about that sort of the bow tie, right? That you need to have the common IP or essentially we're going to have a common controller. We already we have more software engineers than hardware engineers. We provide a lot of our value in the software space. As this ecosystem is going to evolve, though, we need to move our software up above the controller. But to do that, we need to have a controller. We don't want to write it for 15 different controllers. So this is good for us, you know, to be able to shift gears from this embedded software company, which you don't see our software unless you buy our hardware, to a model where we're offering you software value, but it sits on top of that controller. So we need this controller. This controller is good for us. As it happens, our customers also want it. You know, so like you said, community is a bunch of people, but it's also a bunch of firms, and you know, the service providers particularly like us, you know, going toward that open source model for a bunch of it, because essentially that means that it's not proprietary anymore, and they end up having the competition in the layers, and you can buy the best in breed.
And
So
it may
play that
sound
game,
corny,
which is disruptive, and it's good for us.
but it's the right thing to do, right? I mean, that's how you do this, right? You basically accept the fact that there's going to be some investment that goes to the whole. You accept the fact that this is a zero-sum game, that we're all in this together, and that, yeah, we have to compete and we have to kick each other's butt whenever we can, but at some level, there's certain things that are so important to get built that it's important that we do it together, and we take that cost out of it, because it's how we move forward.
So, and just to follow up on that, as I said earlier, we're talking here about technology and open source, right? But really, the open source thing is about collaboration. It's way more powerful than any instance of technology, and that is what's going to change networking, not any given artifact that gets built.
Because what you see in those groups is the cross-pollination between different vendors, right? I mean, how much easier is it for a problem to get solved between two vendors now in an open daylight situation when you have those same vendors working together to get projects out, right? So you start building those personal relationships that you can reach out to if you need to get something done. It greases the wheels and lets us solve a lot more problems in the long frame.